And my concern is that if we're not attentive to the fact that there's an additional spiritual valence, we might not be able to get the science right.
How do you describe your spiritual journey?
Hey, humans! Welcome to this week's Demystifying Science. Before we get going on our conversation about the collapse of the spiritual economy and what it has to do with physics, do yourself a huge favor. Subscribe to the channel and ask for notifications. That way you're connected on Mondays when we put out our new episodes. We got all kinds of explorations coming your way.
Why subjective morality appeals to some humans, why it might be better to stay away from institutions, the powerful gravity of abnormal psychology, and why some people love to be bossed around. Today's episode, though, is all about the fine line between physics and spirit.
These two things don't seem necessarily related to one another, but hear us out. When it comes to human science these days, all explanations eventually come back to physics. And while mathematical convolutions of quantum theory and fluid dynamics can make humans pretty good engineers, physics alone can't address the emergent properties of biology. Like, why do you want what you want? Where does the human capacity for transcendent experience come from? Why has it been so central to all of human history?
One possible explanation is that many phenomena cannot be reduced to pure physical mechanics. Birth, death, will, meaning, love can't be totally encompassed by a volumetric description of atoms drifting between synapses, which suggests that physicalist science can't possibly yield answers to all of life's questions. This doesn't discount the contribution of a materialist worldview to humans' technological development, but it does suggest a more integrated perspective is necessary.
Opening this can of metaphysical worms invites larger discussion about the foundational nature of science that many of its practitioners don't necessarily want to deal with. If there are scientific questions that physics can't answer, what does that mean for the Enlightenment ideals upon which the entire practice is founded?
That is a great question, because many of the most foundational tenets of modern materialist science are thought to have emerged during the European Enlightenment at the start of the 1700s. For the first time in nearly 1,000 years, the authority of the Catholic Church waned across all of Europe. Kings and queens rose to replace the Pope, and began an arms race of knowledge and conquest. The society with the greatest ability to know the world and build the greatest weapons would surely triumph. Natural philosophers who had previously measured their words carefully lest they meet Galileo's fate were freed by Descartes' neat description of what he called mind-body dualism.
In the dualist view, there were two separate aspects of existence, the physical, corporeal realm and the sphere of the mind. Somewhere inside the brain was a physical portal that connected the two. Perhaps, as Descartes later suggested, it was the pineal gland, but any structure could have been used to rationalize that bridge.
Over time, the science that emerged during this period fractured into three different disciplines that were part of a distinct hierarchy. Biology was a product of physics and chemistry, chemistry was a product of physics, and physics? Well, to know that was to know the secrets of the universe.
Human scientific progress suddenly felt like it was nearing its end, a point at which everything would be neatly understood. The dualism of the Enlightenment meant that spiritual matters were largely left in the hands of the Church, but as faith in the Church of Physics grew, many were lured in by the obscure and unfathomable depths of quantum, and faith in traditional religion ebbed.
Eventually, the old world religious decline developed to a point that the very idea of dualism became an unnecessary and antiquated holdover. It was a shadow of a supernatural past that humans didn't think they needed anymore, now that they were on the verge of a physical, or at least pseudo-physical, theory of everything. More and more, physics pointed towards a monist perspective, that life and consciousness could be invariably reduced to nothing more than material interactions.
Problem is, even with your ability to smash atoms together and your impressive technological advancements, you humans are no closer to answering the question of how to get along, how to avoid cyclic social unrest. And perhaps it's time to consider that the kind of science that will actually be able to deal with those kind of questions is going to have to integrate the deeper history of spirituality throughout your species' earthly history.
Archaeologists have found evidence of intentional human burial from nearly 300,000 years ago.
That's a long time.
That is.
But is that evidence of spirituality or religion?
Well, some Earthlings think so, because burial indicates having developed the idea that there's something beyond this plane of existence. But if that's too shaky for your tastes, we can look at more recent examples. Hinduism and Zoroastrianism are about 15,000 years old. Judaism has been around for roughly 5,000 years. Jainism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, Shintoism are on par with that. Christianity has been around for 2,000 years. And the youngest of the major religions, Islam, has been practiced for about 1,400 years.
And that doesn't even take into account the myriad religions that were never large enough to count on the global stage. For better or for worse, religion seems to be baked into the way you humans operate. Every culture on Earth has been shaped by the presence of God or gods, which rule the world and tell you how to behave in order to do right by your tribe.
Since any practice that's been around for thousands of years with a priest class administration that has profited wildly from its dominance is suspect, it's easy to see the appeal of rationalism as a reaction to the failures of spiritualism. Add on some other key ideals of the Enlightenment, the nation-state, freedom of speech, the idea of inalienable rights, and the whole thing seems to promise a much more beautiful world than the repression of a controlling priesthood.
Like any good idea, though, there were serious problems. Rationalism set humans on a path that interrupted the indebtedness to nature that had given rise to ideas like sin and purity. It must have been intoxicating to step into a world that was free from the unbearable yoke of guilt.
That freedom, though, might not be working out so well for you humans. It turns out that in the absence of religious faith, you humans lose the sense that there's something greater than you, and the scientific impulse can run amok. Just because you can research something, like gain of function and viruses, should you? What about atom bombs? Or genetically modified mosquitoes that you release into the population?
Well, if those topics do prove important, can you at least set ground rules for the research so that contingency plans can be established? To know the world only in a hyper-rational frame forces you to deny the other half of human experience, the ancestral, the cultural, and the transcendent. There's another half of biology beyond physics, and more to the world than can be measured, marked, and counted out. To maintain your humanity, it might be necessary to nurture an economy of spirit, one which takes the non-physical motivations into account, like friendship, trust, grief, art, dance, music.
If neglected, religious tendencies will reappear where you least expect them. For example, in today's culture wars, where there's been a reawakening of the dialogue around purity and stain after a century-long absence. Again, the notion of those who have transgressed and those who have been transgressed against has reappeared to fill the void that was left after the death of God.
This narrative reaches back to the idea of original sin, where humans carry with them this indelible stain that must always be pushed against, unless it blossomed. Except, in this new version of the ancient stories, where there are those born as ancestral oppressors and those born carrying the ancestral trauma of oppression, today there seems to be no chance of forgiveness.
And without a path to absolution, it's impossible to build a future. All that's left is to violently tear at the walls of the only system that's ever codified the idea of human rights, or come close to ending famine.
Though it feels empowering to stand in opposition to entrenched systems, it might be that dismantling the status quo without a plan for a better future is seriously risky. If the ideal of justice comes without forgiveness, it's nothing more than vengeance that will perpetuate an unending cycle of violence.
The tragedy of the situation is that there's no easy answer. Maybe it isn't possible to go back to the world of religion en masse. Maybe it isn't even desirable. It's a pretty serious slaughterhouse back there. Science as a discipline, however, has failed to take into account the mysterious piece of humans that goes beyond molecules crashing into each other. Finding a language to scientifically address the transcendent is the only way to find your way back to forgiveness.
All of us animals live in a world that's impure and imperfect, and each of us must rise above that stain on a daily basis in order to keep from descending into impenetrable darkness.
The conversation that follows with Dr. Joshua Mitchell explores what's happening in the US and Europe these days through the lens of left-right politics and the death of God and religion. It's a little different from what we usually do, but we hope you like it.
So subscribe to the channel.
Click through to the whole conversation that follows, and come back next Monday for a new conversation about the occurrence of universal morality with University of Pennsylvania scholar Dr. Corey Clark. See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.